When 6 votes change everything. It started like any other day in Washington, D.C. Court clerks moving between chambers, reporters checking their phones for breaking alerts. But then, a single document hit the Supreme Court's public docket. 6 justices, united in a majority, just made a decision that will ripple through the lives of over 600,000 people. No, this wasn't about guns, not abortion, not student loans or free speech. This was about immigration, but not the border wall kind of immigration you hear about in every political speech. This was about people who've been here for years, legally, working jobs, raising kids, people who were protected by something called TPS, Temporary Protected Status. Until now, the Supreme Court just ruled that the government can end those protections immediately without having to explain themselves. And for hundreds of thousands of families, it means the ground they've built their lives on may have just disappeared overnight. But the ruling isn't just about them. It's about judges, power, and whether courts still get to decide how immigration laws are enforced. And it just changed the playbook for every future president, Democrat or Republican. Chapter 1. The ruling that silenced a judge and shocked the country. Let's rewind. If you've never heard of Judge Edward Chen, you're not alone. Most Americans haven't. But in legal circles, he's been at the center of one of the biggest immigration fights in the country. Judge Chen, appointed by President Obama in 2011, sat on the bench in California's Northern District, and for years he's been the go-to judge for immigration activists. Not by coincidence, by strategy. Because when groups wanted to block deportations or preserve protected status for immigrants, they knew filing in Chen's courtroom gave them a better chance. It worked for a while. In the case of Venezuelans and Haitians under TPS, Judge Chen issued injunction after injunction, temporary legal shields that prevented the government from ending their status. The Department of Homeland Security would move to revoke the protection. Judge Chen would stop it, again and again. But then came the Supreme Court. And they weren't interested in politics. They were interested in who has it and who doesn't. In a 6-3 decision, the court said plainly, lower judges don't get to override executive immigration enforcement. If a president grants temporary status, the next president has every right to take it away. No permission slip from the courts is required. That one sentence changed the lives of 600,000 people. And it sent a message to every federal judge. Your bench is not more powerful than the Constitution. Chapter 2. When a dissent tells a different story. Not everyone on the bench agreed. Justices Ketanji Brown Jackson, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan dissented, and their reasoning was powerful, emotional, and controversial. Justice Jackson, writing the main dissent, didn't focus on the Constitution. She focused on people. She wrote about the conditions in Venezuela, the economic collapse, the blackouts, the political persecution, and the empty grocery stores. She argued that ending TPS without a humanitarian plan was not just unwise, it was, in her words, cruel. To Jackson, this wasn't just about whether the executive branch had the power to revoke protections. It was about whether doing so right now was the kind of government we wanted to be. But here's the counter-argument, the one that 6 justices agreed on. TPS was never meant to be permanent. It was designed as a stopgap, a short-term shield after natural disasters or violent conflict, not a replacement for legal immigration, and not a backdoor path to residency. If humanitarian crises automatically justify indefinite protected status, then what stops every country with crime, poverty, or corruption from qualifying forever? At some point, temporary has to mean temporary. Otherwise, the system collapses under its own contradictions. Chapter 3. Real people. Real years. Real consequences. To understand why this ruling matters, you have to meet the people it affects. Take Eduardo, for example. He came from Venezuela in 2010 after food riots erupted in his city. He applied for TPS and got approved. He learned English, got a job in Florida, married another TPS recipient, and had 2 kids who are U.S. citizens. He pays taxes, owns a used car dealership, and coaches Little League. For the past 14 years, Eduardo has lived a version of the American dream, one built on a status that was never supposed to last more than 18 months. Now, his protection can be revoked at any moment. Not by a judge, not by a local vote, but by the Department of Homeland Security with a single signature. This is not a story about criminals or people sneaking across borders. These are people who were here legally, people who followed the rules. And now the rules have changed. From 600,000 to million. The real numbers behind the headlines. Most headlines mentioned one number, 600,000, but that's not the whole story. There are TPS holders from more than a dozen countries, including El Salvador, Haiti, Honduras, Nepal, Nicaragua, Sudan, Syria, South Sudan, Ukraine, and Yemen. When you include every country that received a TPS designation in the last 15 years, the number climbs to over 1.2 million people. Not all of them will lose protection overnight. Some designations are still valid and haven't been challenged, but the ruling sets a clear precedent. All of them can be ended at any time without judicial review. This means that future administrations, whether Republican or Democrat, now have enormous power to reshape the immigration map without passing a single new law. This isn't just a shift in policy, it's a shift in how the United States defines its moral and legal obligations to people already within our borders. Chapter 4. The Shadow System. Nobody voted for. For years, Americans thought immigration policy was made by Congress, or maybe the president. But in reality, there was a third player behind the curtain: federal judges. Over the last 8 years, more than 300 nationwide injunctions were issued by individual district court judges, blocking immigration policies coast to coast with just a few keystrokes. Imagine this: a single judge in California could stop a nationwide deportation policy intended for Florida, Texas, and Ohio, even if voters in those states had elected leaders who supported it. That's exactly what happened. The reason? Activist organizations started forum shopping. That means they filed lawsuits in districts where they knew the judges leaned sympathetic to their cause. Most notably in the Northern District of California, where one judge's name kept coming up: Judge Edward Chen. Appointed by President Obama, Chen had a long history as a lawyer for the ACLU, the same group pushing to keep TPS permanent. Since becoming a federal judge, he's ruled against immigration enforcement over 40 times. In this TPS case, he issued an injunction that blocked the government from ending protections for Venezuelans and Haitians, claiming procedural steps hadn't been followed. His rulings delayed deportations for years, not just for people in his courtroom, but for the entire country. It became what legal experts now call injunction creep, where something temporarily quietly becomes permanent because no one has the power or the political will to undo it. Until now. Chapter 5. The Supreme Court closes the loophole. This case wasn't just about immigration, it was about authority. The Supreme Court looked at this shadow system and said, enough. The majority ruled that judges do not have the power to override federal immigration enforcement decisions. The Constitution gives Congress the power to make the laws and the executive branch the power to enforce them. Judges cannot insert themselves as the final word on policy. This ruling doesn't just apply to TPS, it applies to any executive immigration program, including DACA, parole expansions, or humanitarian waivers. If a future president wants to end them, they can. No lengthy justification, no multi-year lawsuits, no injunctions standing in the way. The majority opinion said it clearly. Temporary programs can be ended because they are temporary. That single line just erased years of procedural gamesmanship that had turned immigration law into a courtroom battlefield. Chapter 6. Presidential Power Unleashed. The moment this ruling came down, and every immigration attorney in the country understood one thing: the balance of power just shifted. For the past 2 decades, immigration programs like TPS or DACA were protected by layers of litigation. Even if a new president wanted to end them, they'd have to jump through a legal maze that could last years with no guaranteed outcome. But now, the maze is gone. Thanks to the Supreme Court decision, any president can end a temporary immigration program with a single memo. No court hearings, no public comment periods, and no permanent protection just because something lasted a long time. It's a double-edged sword. For immigration hardliners, this is a dream scenario. If a president wants to aggressively deport anyone without permanent status, even if they've lived in the US for decades, they now have the authority to do it quickly and cleanly. But for immigration advocates, it's a nightmare. The people they've worked so hard to protect are now hanging by a thread, and that thread is political. Presidents now have more control over the fate of entire communities than ever before. And with elections shifting every 4 years, millions of lives could swing dramatically based on who holds the Oval Office. Chapter 7. The 2026 Effect. Why this ruling matters now? You might be wondering, why is this so important right now? Because this ruling didn't just come in a vacuum. It came in the middle of a political cycle where immigration is the #1 issue in several swing states. And with over 600,000 TPS holders from Venezuela, Haiti, El Salvador, and more concentrated in states like Florida, Texas, and Arizona. This ruling just supercharged presidential power at a critical moment. It's not just legal, it's an election. Both parties are now weighing how to use this new power. Will one candidate promise to end TPS protections on day one? Will another offer permanent residency by executive order? The message from the Supreme Court is clear. The choice now belongs to the people you elect. Not the judges, not the bureaucrats, not the lawyers dragging cases out for years. One president, one signature. That's all it takes now. Chapter 8. What the media did not tell you. While the Supreme Court's decision sent shockwaves through legal and immigrant communities, the media's response was strangely quiet. Most headlines downplayed the ruling, focusing instead on isolated case details. Some even framed it as a procedural immigration case, barely mentioning the historic constitutional shift it created. But here's the truth the mainstream coverage missed. This ruling was never just about TPS. It was about the limits of executive power, the boundaries of judicial review, and whether courts can permanently lock in temporary policies just because people have grown used to them. For years, judges across the country were treating long-standing policies like they had transformed into untouchable rights. This case reminded every court that permanence does not come from habit. It comes from Congress, and only Congress. By reversing lower court decisions and refusing to create a reliance right, the Supreme Court drew a hard constitutional line. Temporary status is temporary, and now that line is law. Chapter 9. The human cost no one is talking about. Here's what no press release, no politician, and no news outlet is truly showing you. Over 600,000 people across America just woke up to a new legal reality. Their homes, jobs, and families may remain the same, but the legal ground beneath their feet has shifted dramatically. TPS holders from Venezuela, El Salvador, Haiti, and other nations, many of whom have been here for over 20 years, can now lose their status with the stroke of a pen. There is no appeals process, no guaranteed legal pathway, no promise of protection. Even their US-born children, many of whom are now adults, cannot shield them from deportation once that memo comes down. These are not criminals. These are community members, workers, neighbors, parents, veterans, and now everything they've built can vanish with one election. This isn't about politics. It's about how fragile life in America can be when your future is tied to a temporary permission slip. Chapter 10. What does this ruling mean for all of us? Even if immigration isn't your issue, this decision affects you. Why? Because it redefines how executive orders, administrative programs, and temporary protections function in our legal system. It means that any future president, regardless of party, can now reverse massive policies, not just immigration, but education, healthcare, environmental rules, and more, without waiting for years of litigation. It hands the executive branch a tool that was previously dulled by courts and procedural delays. Now, that tool is sharp again, and whether it's used for good or bad, freedom or control, rights or restrictions, depends entirely on who wins the next election. If you thought the courts could always step in and save you, this case says otherwise. It says constitutional power rests with the branches you vote for, not the judges you rely on after the fact. This is not over. This case will be remembered as one of the most quietly transformative rulings of the decade, not because it shouted, but because it changed everything without making a sound. If you or someone you know is affected by TPS, DACA, or any temporary immigration program, now is the time to pay attention. Not later, not after the next memo, not after the next election. Right now, because the legal protections you thought were permanent may have just expired, and the constitutional landscape you trusted to hold the line just got redrawn. This is Firearms Law Advisor. Subscribe if you care about real legal updates, not media spin, not political clickbait, but the rulings that reshape our rights and responsibilities. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and stay alert. Because in today's America, one case can still change 600,000 lives, and maybe more.